So this morning is our final message in the household series. And I just want to start by saying a big thank you to everyone for the way you've engaged with us in this, because it's probably been the strongest level of engagement that we have had with our congregation in one of our preaching series recently. We've had a lot of people respond to us about the different things they're doing in their households and the way that they're tweaking things and building relationships, and it's been exciting to see. And our hope and prayer is that beyond this series, that you will continue to be building the strength of your households in whatever capacity that looks like. Now, next week, we'll be going into a brand new teaching series, and it's going to be called Rhythms of Grace. And that teaching series is all about finding and discovering God's rest. And we're going to be looking at limitations, looking at the Sabbath, looking at depending on God in different ways. And so I hope that you can join us and be a part of that as we kick that off together next week. Now, for this morning's message, we're going to be building on a couple of different concepts that we've already started talking about through the household series. And so I'm just going to recap a couple of things together so that we've got a firm footing on what we'll discuss together today. Now, you might remember the first message in this series, we talked about taking responsibility. And in that first message, we looked at that passage in Joshua where he says, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Okay, and we talked all about our faith and how our faith can impact an entire household. Your faith can impact the people that you live with in profound ways. And it takes that choice of saying, I'm going to take responsibility for my faith and allow it to be seen and visible in my household context. We're going to build on that. You may also remember a message where we spoke about becoming a household team. And that was all about strengthening the communication and the relationships inside of a household and how you can learn to work together to achieve some common goals. We want to build on that this morning. See, today we're going to be talking all about living as a household on mission. What does it mean for us to live as a household that is all on mission together? Now, as part of this, we're also going to build on a concept that we spoke about last year in a series called Eyes on the Prize. You might remember that. It was a stewardship series, and we spoke a lot about finances. But there is a principle in there that I believe is relevant and important to us in our discussion today. And that is this. You know that you're invested in God when you use what He has given you to do what He has commanded you. Do you remember us talking about that? You know that your heart is fully invested in God when you take what He has put in your hands and you use that to do the things that He has called you to do. And in that series, we spoke all about the kingdom mission of going and making disciples, using our resources to invest into God's mission. Well, that's important for us to now build on as we discuss this in our household series. And so here's a key question I want you to consider. How can you use your household for God's mission? How can you use your household? In other words, the relationships that you have, the team that you've been building at home, or even the physical resources that you might have. How can you use your household for God's mission that He has called you to? That same mission of making disciples, of loving other people the way that God has loved you. I believe there are a number of ways that we can use what God has given us to do what He has called us to do. And I just want to show you a couple of examples in the book of Acts, in the early New Testament there, about the way that the early church would use their households, their homes, for kingdom mission. And there are a couple of examples here. In Acts 2, we see that the believers met together and they would break bread and they would share meals together. Now, in the New Testament, when it says they would break bread, it meant they were sharing communion together. They were remembering what Jesus had done. But not just this, they were having meals together in their households. They were building community and relationships, deepening their connection with one another. And this was taking place in their homes. We also saw that there were believers selling their homes, selling their possessions as a way of resourcing the mission that they had. You see, these early believers, they realized that what God has given them was a tool. And so they desired to use that tool to resource other people, to bless other people as an example of God's loving nature. We see in Acts chapter 5 that the believers were teaching in their households. They were opening up their Bibles. They were learning and discussing, praying, teaching one another. And you've got to understand, this is a little bit different at that time because in their point in history, the Jewish religion was centered around the synagogue. That's where you would go to share in teaching. But all of a sudden, the disciples started using their homes for teaching and encouraging one another. In the book of Philemon, I can never say that book right, can you? I'm going to go with Philemon. Chapter 1, verse 2, we see that whole churches were gathering. This was the expression of the house church beginning. And so I don't know what that looked like, but there was a bigger gathering. There was probably worship and celebration, prayer, encouragement. There were church gatherings happening in a household. And then we see later in the book of Acts, Priscilla and Aquila, they open up their home to the Apostle Paul. And it wasn't just for an overnight stay, but the Apostle Paul stayed with them long term, and he used their home as a bit of a springboard into their community. And he worked as a tent maker, and he taught in their synagogues and in their community, and he stayed there for an extended period of time. Now, these are just a few snapshots. Just imagine a few Polaroids that we can pin up of the early church in the book of Acts. But as you can see, their households and their homes were critical to their mission. They had cottoned on to the idea that what they had was a resource to be used for God's kingdom mission. And in the same way that they did that then, I believe that we are called to do that now. To use what God has given us, to do what God has called us to do. And so how do we use our households? How do we use what God has given us to further the kingdom, to reach people for Jesus, to love other people the way that God has loved us? Well, that's what we want to discuss together today. Now, to do that, we're going to do something a little bit different, and we're going to share in an interview. And in a moment, I'm going to invite some friends up, and we're going to interview them about the way that they have been using their household for God's kingdom mission. And so what I want to do now is invite Scott and Leanne Beard to come up. You guys might want to welcome them as they come forward. And we're going to learn from them. Now, many of you here may know Scott and Leanne, and I know some of you are new here and probably haven't met them before. But to give you a bit of an idea, these guys have been involved in a whole range of different ministries in our church here. They've been involved as youth leaders. They've run small groups, kids programs, retreats, worship. They've been in eldership, men's ministry. I've probably missed a few things, haven't I? Okay, the list goes on. And so they've been involved in ministry here heavily for a long period of time. And I know that Scott and Leanne have an incredible passion to use what God has given them for kingdom mission. And we've had a number of different conversations about this. But in recent years, they have begun opening up their home as an expression of the kingdom. And they've had all sorts of different people live with them, some of them short-term, some of them long-term. They've had young adults come and stay with them and board with them. And we could probably just stop there because that might be challenging enough to unpack. But they've had young adults living there. They've had people who were recovering from drug and alcohol addiction come and stay with them. They've had people come and stay who their marriage was struggling. So one of those people came and stayed with Scott and Leanne as they were trying to just work through some of those issues together. They've had family and friends come and stay. And of course, recently they've engaged in the foster care process as well. And so, Scott and Leanne, it's great to have you up here this morning.
I don't know if I turned this on properly.
Your microphones are on.
Hello.
We got past our feedback issues. All good. And so, church, what we're going to do this morning is I've got a couple of different questions, and we're just going to glean from what God has been teaching them through these experiences. And my hope is as we discuss this together, that this might encourage you or even give you some new creative ideas about how you can use what God has given you for his kingdom mission. And so the first question I'm going to ask for Leanne is actually, what has made you want to open up your home in the way that you have? Because obviously that's a big jump to have gone and done that. How did you discern God's leading to do that?
Good question. I love that Ryan introduced this segment with the people of Acts. They just so faithfully gave what they had to God, it seems almost without a thought. And so in all honesty, our experience was a little bit the same. When I was young, when I was in my teen years working at McDonald's, God actually took me on a journey of teaching me about tithes and offering. And so ever since then, I've actually been quite faithful in that because of that journey that he taught me when I was quite young. So when my dad passed away, my mum was very generous and gave us some money. We decided to put a deposit on a house, and it just actually quite seemed like the natural response to hand that back over to God and allow him to work in that space and for that to become a resource that he used for his kingdom. In terms of what we've used our house for. Ryan's mentioned a few things. We've done a youth, young adults life group. We've had a youth band in our back studio that we had, a back room garage that we turned into a recording studio. We've done respite for youth. We've had people come and stay with us who just needed to get away from their situation, whatever it was. People used to come and crawl through our doggy door at home just to get out of their house for the day when we were at work and have some pet therapy with our dog Jackson. So our home has just been quite open. It just seemed like quite the natural response. But to answer the part about how did we discern, I actually don't think we did. It just, like I said, seemed like that natural response to hand that huge gift back over to God. We got more than what we needed, so it made sense to hand it back over. However, I guess through the process of choosing to have that open home, we've had to discern along the way the right opportunities to who we allow into our home. And there was one situation where we didn't feel right, so we sometimes spent time prayer and fasting, and other times we just knew it was right and went, oh, hey, you need a house, come live with us. So yeah.
And I love that, because what you're talking about there is kind of going, this home was God's anyway. You know, it's kind of his resource, so we're just looking after it. But I love how you just said there that you then had to discern the opportunities that came before you. Because it can be easy to think just because an opportunity comes before us, oh, is that just God's open door? But I know it's taken a lot of intentionality for you guys as you've prayed through those different decisions.
We actually waited 2 years, I think it was, from the moment where we felt God saying you need to open your home, to our first housemate. And we were in Queensland having a meal at my brother's place, and I went inside to get a drink or something, and I thought I'll check my phone because it was inside, and I had 3 missed calls from Lisa Paxton or Blunden. She was working for a mission group, Urban Neighbours of Hope in Melbourne, and she's like, oh, I've got this dude, he's going to be dead or, going to be shot in a couple of days if he doesn't get out of Melbourne. Can you take him in? I'm like, yeah, no worries, we'll do that. She's like, no, you need to go and talk to your husband. I'm like, no, it's all good. She's like, no. I'm like, no, we know that this is happening. We know that this is coming. And I went outside to Scott and I was like, oh, I've got someone moving in when we get back. He's like, okay, cool. And so it was very natural response.
It's good. And so obviously you've had people come and stay with you who are Christians, non-Christians, probably everything in between there. And so faith has been an important part of your expression of the household. And so Scott, I'm particularly interested to know from you, where does faith come into the dynamic of your home?
Yeah, well, it's kind of the foundation and the motivation for everything that we do. It's very central to what started the process, and it's central to what allows us to keep going. But how it presents in the household is very different depending on who's living with us.
Yeah.
Because some people have a faith, some people don't have a faith, and so sometimes what we have is a very spoken faith. We have lots of conversations with people. I remember one time there was us and 2 others living in the house, and we were all studying at ACOM, Australian College of Ministries, which is Church of Christ Bible College. And we're all studying the same subjects, so that was lots of fun, lots of conversations, competitions about who was going to win get the best results for the essays and all that kind of stuff. And other times it's very modelled. We just live transparently, and that's had an impact too. I remember my brother-in-law living with us for a while, and we had a few conversations with him where the way that we lived our life had impacted him deeply. And he had a lot of conversations with how our marriage was lived out, and how that example, how he saw that example, and that impacted him in a great deal, and how we were so generous with people, and he saw that and called it out, and that impacted him too. Nowadays with the kids, we pray with them regularly. We talk about God all the time. About 4 weeks ago we started a little family Bible study, which has been fun. That's opt-in, opt-out, whatever you want, but all of them come and have continued to ask for it to keep going. So there's been lots of different ways, but for Leanne and I, it's really what keeps us going. It's our sustenance. It's the one thing that we can genuinely rely on. That doesn't change.
Yeah. And look, for someone who's known Scott and Leanne for a long time, I know that they have modeled their faith in so many incredible ways. And I think that's one of their strengths, is that no matter who comes into their household, they get a tangible experience of the gospel. You know, you rock up and Leanne's got food in front of you before you've even realized it. And, you know, after you've been there a little while, there's deep conversations that happen. And I know that you've been really intentional about looking for those opportunities when people come around. Now, as I'm sure as many people would realize, when you have multiple people living in the one household, culture can shift a little bit, and particularly when new people come into a house. And so I'm particularly curious about how have you sought to maintain the culture in your house? Because as some people come and go, they bring culture with them, and right now you guys are outnumbered. So, you know, how are you maintaining culture in your home?
Yeah, it's been super tough, especially the last few years. You know, the last 3.5 years, we've sold a house, we've moved, we've gone from a completely adults ministry to having 4 kids in the house. So it's been incredibly tough, and in a lot of ways, we're still trying to catch up with the whirlwind, you know, that's been going on for the last little while. But really, I think it's so important to set expectations early. When everything's starting, and if you're dealing with adults in particular, I can't recommend a household covenant enough. It's on paper, both of us sign it, it gives you something to refer back to, it sets the expectation very clear, it opens line of communication in both directions. If you're going to put somebody else in your space and you're the one on the lease, or you own the house or whatever else, they actually need authority to come to you and say, you're doing something that isn't really fair, or isn't really, you know, doesn't sit well with me. So you need that both ways, and, you know, covenant's really good for that. Yeah, it also gives you spiritual boundaries that you can set to say, we don't want this object in our house, or we don't want this type of practice happening in our house, because this is a Christian home and it belongs to Jesus. So it gives you that authority to do that as well. Nowadays, with the way that our season changed, we tried really hard to set up a home. Something that felt like home. You know, we bought matching furniture, we got bread spreads, we did all these sorts of things that we really tried to make these guys feel like they had a home and it was their space. And that they could come in and feel at home and part of the family. We have family dinner night, so whether it was before when people were living with us, or whether it's now with the kids, every week we have a family dinner night. Everyone's invited. Leanne's mum comes over, you know, things like that. And whoever's there is invited into that space. You're part of the family. Be part of that. Pray regularly. We pray for God's covering over our house on a regular basis, and we'll use resources outside of ourselves. Larry has come and prayed for us a few times in our different homes. We use books that have spiritual prayers in them that give you a bit of a formula for how to pray for a covering over your house. So we've been very specific about that. Communicate regularly. Whether it's with each other, whether it's with the people living with you, communicate all the time. Learn from every situation. Be willing to be the one who's learning as well as the one who's giving. Grow personally. I've devoured, even in the last 6 weeks, I've devoured books, seminars, webinars, information, this household series. I've gone back over that and I've written notes. We sat our kids down the other day and we did Rachel's thing with some household goals, and that was really helpful. And so now we're sort of sitting on those things, household goals and rules that even the kids have been able to put into that they want to see happening within our house. So everybody's kind of got their voice. So it's just a constant process of learning, reacting, implementing. Yeah.
And what I'm hearing from that, and what I hope you're hearing too, is that household culture doesn't just happen by accident. You know, particularly when you're inviting other people to come and live in your space, it doesn't just accidentally happen or turn out the way that you want it to. There's a lot of intentionality from the decor that you've helped choose to make spaces welcoming, to the agreements that you've made together about the way you're going to live. That's all very intentional. And I think that's important to recognise.
Yeah, and you've got to react too, because it changes, the season changes, you learn from the situation. It's not because we had it all figured out and then we invited someone into our space. We didn't even know what God was doing. It took 2 years for God to actually bring somebody to us, and we're just like, what are you doing, God? Where is this person? This is your ministry, this is your home, and nobody's here, it's empty. You know, and so you don't have it all figured out. You work it out. You be with God. You let God reveal things to you as you go.
Okay. Now, from the outside, it's easy to celebrate and go, wow, like, that's so exciting, you know, what a great mission field and everything like that. But I know it comes at a cost, and I know that there's heartbreak and challenges that come with this. So what are some of the challenges that you've had to walk through as part of sharing your home with so many different people?
Sharing one bathroom with 4 girls. That's the first one. That's a lot of hair in drains. Aside from that, I think I'm an extrovert. I love spending time with people and I can be quite energised by that. But having people live in my space, I learnt very quickly that I actually really like being alone too. And that I actually really need that to connect with God, and so that has been a real struggle, is not having that mental, physical, emotional space that I had previously when we were just by ourselves. That's probably the biggest challenge. I think that's kind of my desire to feel comfortable coming out, but I know that living in the uncomfortableness of having the people that we've had and the people we've been able to bless and help far outweighs the comfort. I was listening to a sermon the other day that said comfort and growth don't go together. So I continue to be challenged in that area. But yeah, I think just not having our own space. But I guess there's also then the emotional toll that it can take, and especially like sometimes it's really difficult living with people who have different values, have been brought up in a different way, and that can bring conflict. So sometimes when you're working and you've got the emotional toll of what you're dealing with at work, and then having to come home to deal with more stuff in your space that should be, where you can unwind, that can be really challenging. And for a lot of people, home is where you come to switch off. So it can be challenging when you've been at work, you've been doing other things, and you come home to a mission field. And that's the same whether you've got family or housemates or guests staying with you. But it's worth acknowledging, because for all of us, we do need a safe space that we can. Or a sink full of dishes, and you're like, oh, really, again? And so, and especially when you're living with adults and you expect that I clean up after myself, you clean up, and then you come home from work, you're like, oh, again. So I'm sure many of you feel that pain with your teenage children as well, perhaps, or your adult children. But yeah, that emotional toll of work and then coming home and not being able to switch off is probably one of the biggest challenges,
Okay. Scotty, how about for you? Have there been challenges?
Oh, so many. I'm not an extrovert, so, having people in my space all the time is definitely a challenge. Lots of things we've had to, I guess, deal with over the years, but really it comes back to what I said before: clear boundaries, clear expectations, clear line of communication in both directions, so that you can be challenged as well as challenge issues that you may have. It's just, really tough, but you just got to work with God, learn, grow as you go. And I was reading yesterday, I think it's Luke chapter 7, it talks about how if you only love those people who love you, what difference are you? Even the sinners do that. And there's a whole list of these challenges that are the same. And I think that speaks it so clearly to me, that when you take that into the conflict, it changes everything. So, Jesus is trying to reframe people to see them as God's people, to love them the way that God does, not the way that we want to, the easy, comfortable way. Love the unlovable person. And so when you take that attitude into conflict, it changes everything.
We just segued into my next question, actually, because I wanted to ask you about conflict, because as you can imagine, living in a group dynamic, there's always going to be conflict of some sort, because everyone's got their own agendas and schedules and ideas and all the rest. So what would be some of the tips that maybe you've learnt about resolving conflict in a healthy way?
Scott mentioned having a covenant before. We learnt that a little bit late in our open home ministry, but it's critical to have that written agreement that people can contribute to. We don't just create the document and go, here, this is how it is. We actually have a conversation and ask them. There's some non-negotiables on there for us, but we actually ask them, is there anything missing that you think should be on here? And we've had some really valuable contributions. So having that covenant, when there is conflict, you can come back to it and say, hey, remember we actually agreed to this when you moved in and we had this discussion. So that can be really helpful to have that, and even having that with your kids as well. As a household, this is what we agree to do and this is how we agree to treat each other. Then you can be coming back to that in a conversation where there is conflict as well. When you need to confront someone about something, I think timing is really important. Sometimes we are a bit like a bull in a china shop and we have an issue to confront, so you just want to confront it there and then. But we really need to consider the person and what's going on in their world as well in when we choose our timing. That's been important for us. For me, it's don't let things fester. When we've had adults living with us and I have my own value set and I'm imposing that on other people, sometimes I can just let it fester instead of actually speaking up about it. And it doesn't have to be a huge confrontation, but just that little conversation of, hey, can you make sure you put your dishes away when you've washed them, or whatever it is, but not letting things fester. And for me, I think that was a bit of an issue because I allowed resentment sometimes to come in. And when all else fails, get your husband to do the dirty work.
Okay, so we should probably ask him then. What are some of the tips for you? Was it getting your wife to do it, or?
No, it doesn't work that way. The buck stops here, apparently. So yeah, it's got to, things have to be dealt with, right? So you've got to do that, and you know the challenges are that everybody comes with all their baggage, you know, and you have your own baggage as well. So you're wading through all of that together, and you've just got to really honour the person. You've got to love the person, like I said, and you know you've got to see the conflict for what it is, not that the person is evil or the enemy or whatever else. You've really got to just see the person as God's children, and you've invited them in because God asked you to. So like, how do you then go and treat them like they're not God's children? Because you know we are God's creation. And so, yeah, all the things I've said, just be very fully aware of the fact that everyone has their baggage, and, you know, that brings wounds and hurts. And so when you deal with conflict, you're not just dealing with what just happened, you're dealing with all that history. And if you're not careful, you're the next trigger for that person's trauma and history and baggage. So, yeah, you go into it carefully, you go into it with love, and you have all the resources set before you from the beginning as much as you can that allow you to refer back and go, actually, we already had this conversation, and we've set this boundary already, and you've crossed it. What can we do to resolve it now that you've crossed the boundary that we agreed to? So, yeah.
And I've observed and I've watched you guys that you still can love people even with boundaries. And actually, often boundaries are one of the most loving things you can do to set around your household and the people that live there as well.
And there's all kinds of studies that actually say that kids that don't have boundaries don't actually feel safe. And that is research, factual information. So, you know, it's one thing to deal with adults and boundaries, but kids need it even more, where the boundaries are, because then they know they're safe inside those walls. And that's so important.
Yeah. Now, if I was to jump in a time machine and travel back to when you first bought your first home, I would imagine that I'd be looking at a very, very different couple then to what I see before me today. And so I guess I'm curious, just for you to be able to articulate, how has opening your home in a missional way changed or transformed you and your faith? What kind of impact has it had?
A lot. I feel really blessed that God has used us in such incredible ways. It really has been a big blessing. I think if we stayed in our little comfort bubble, we definitely wouldn't be where we are today on our faith journey. The biggest thing, how we have been transformed, is that we have to rely on God. There's a song that I love, and one of the lyrics is, "I need you every hour." And that's how we sometimes feel in our ministries. I need God every hour, every minute, every moment of every day. So it has really pushed us to lean into him, and God is still even challenging us now to lean into him more and more. I think I've also learnt that it feels really good to be obedient to God's calling. I don't know if that sounds silly, but it feels good to be where God has asked you to be. So I feel like our obedience has increased. It's easier for us to say yes to God now than it was 10 years ago, because we've said yes so many times and he's been so incredibly faithful. So it feels good to be obedient to God, and I think we are more obedient. I feel like I'm more obedient in the big things than the small things, to be honest. But yeah, look, I think that's how our faith has been transformed. I think that constant dependency on God has built an ever-increasing intimacy with him as well, because we have to rely on him. I hope that the fruits of the Spirit have been more and more developed in my life. I remember one of my bosses once said to me, "Leanne, don't you know, you don't ask God for patience. He'll give you opportunity to practice it." Well, apparently I prayed for all of the fruits of the Spirit because I get daily opportunity to practice them. So I'm sure God has increased, the display of the fruits of the Spirit in my life, I hope, and shall continue to the day I die, I really hope. But I think also our faith has been increased in the fact that that dependency on God has taught us that we need to carve out time for him. We need rest. In the ministries that we've done, we need space with God, and as a result, years ago, he challenged us to set up daily, weekly, monthly and annual rhythms of spending time and carving out time with him and time for rest. And that's something that we've tried to continue to carry over into our current ministry. It's a little bit more challenging now, but we have really tried to continue to carve out that time for rest and time with God and keep those rhythms.
What about for you, Scotty? How have you grown or changed?
Yeah, what Leanne says speaks for mostly for both of us, but it's really taught me to rely on God for things. It's taught me to look for his will, not mine, in different situations. And what is he doing? What is God doing in this situation? Because this situation sucks right now. And so what's God up to? And so it's taught me to really look for that. And then it's shown me his faithfulness, when it seems hopeless. He's come through in so many circumstances, things that you didn't think you'd see any fruit from a situation, and God somehow starts to bring fruit from it, and you get to be a witness to that in the most intimate of places. And really, it's taught me my own personal limitations, where me ends and God needs to start, how I really need to be dependent on that.
Yeah, it's a real wake-up call, isn't it? Yeah. Now, look, just to finish up this interview, I suppose, I just wanted to ask one last question, because what we don't want to do is say to everybody here, let's go copy and paste, and now copy their ministry and paste it onto your household. That's not the way that we want to suggest by this. I think part of the conversation is going, how do each of us learn to think and discern God's will for our household, and what are we called to do? And so, Leanne, just to finish this up, what kind of encouragement would you give to people here about using their households on mission?
I know it sounds probably to most of you what we've done is big and crazy and perhaps even spectacular, but it's not. We have just simply done what God has asked us to do. So that would be my encouragement, is to listen to God and simply ask him what he wants you to do with the resources that you have. So what we've done has been really challenging, but the rewards have far outweighed the challenges. So my encouragement is to ask God what he wants you to do with what you have. Take stock, look at the resources that God has given you, whether it's little or much, because there's been times where we've had very little, but God has blessed us a lot of the time with much. So whether you've got little or much, you can use it for God's work. So look at what he's given you, ask him how you can be a good steward with that, and be obedient and faithful. I know lots of people in our church, like you're saying, don't just copy and paste. There's lots of people in our church who already use their homes and their other resources in great ways. I know Ryan and Jess have people over all the time, and it's a space where young adults can come for some space and some downtime. I know Lisa Douglas invites all the kids over in her street. Larry and Glenda open their home for prayer ministry. There's lots of people who open their homes for life groups, and I'm sure there's plenty of other things that people have family living with them who don't have anywhere else to go. So there's lots of people already using the resources God has. So you definitely don't need to copy and paste what we've done to be faithful with what God has given you. Look at what God has blessed you with, whether it's little or much, and ask him how you can be a good steward with that and use it. But it doesn't have to be big and crazy. It just needs to be small and faithful. That would be my encouragement.
Yeah, I love that.
She came up with that line all herself. That's a good line, isn't it?
Leanne's Proverbs, okay? Now, look, on behalf of our church, I just want to say thank you so much, not just for sharing today, but for the way that you are living as missionaries and ministers in our community, because you are the hands and feet of Jesus in so many situations. And I think too often that gets swept under the carpet. I just want to publicly acknowledge and say you guys are doing a fantastic job, and so keep going, because we are cheering you on and thanking you for what you do. So can we just thank them now, please? Thanks, guys. So to bring this conversation to a bit of a close, I want to share with you a scripture passage that has been deeply impactful for Jess and I in the way that we consider what does it look like for us to use our home as a mission field. And it comes from the Gospel of Matthew. Here it is, Gospel of Matthew. And this isn't the Message paraphrase, but it's where Jesus is talking about you being the light of the world. And this is what it says. Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colors in the world. God is not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this, as public as a city on a hill. If I make you light bearers, you don't think I'm going to hide you under a bucket, do you? And then he goes on to say this, I'm putting you on a light stand. And now that I've put you there on a hilltop on a light stand, shine. And listen to this. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven. And if you want to take a note or something to write down, that line where it says, keep open house and be generous with your lives. For Jess and I, it's been something that we've held as a bit of a mantra for our home of going, what does it mean for us to be generous and to be open with our home and to use what God has given us for his kingdom purpose? And I love that it goes on to say here that when you do that, you actually prompt other people to respond with God. Because it's not about drawing attention to yourself. It's about pointing people to a loving Heavenly Father. And you're modeling what it looks like to live in his kingdom and in God's household in many ways. And so I want to challenge you to think, how can you use what God has given you to do what God has called you to do? Each of you here are missionaries. Each of you here are ministers of the gospel. Okay, you are all equipped. You all have the gift of the Holy Spirit. You've got a testimony. You've got the living Jesus with you. And so how are each of you going to use what you've been given to achieve this kingdom mission that God has called us to? And as Scott and Leanne just mentioned, so many people in our church are already doing this. And I want to commend you for doing this because I love the way that our church is so generous and hospitable. These are some of the things that characterize who we are as a local church. But for each of us, we can continue to think, what does this look like in practical ways? And so I just want to give you a couple of examples. And as I give you these, not every example may apply to you, but I hope that these just kind of kickstart your thinking about how you might be able to use your home or the team that you have at home for God's kingdom mission. So a couple of things. You might want to host people for meals. Okay, we saw that in the book of Acts. They would invite people over for meals. And so maybe you start opening up your doors and cooking for people. Or maybe for you it's ordering takeaway, depending on where you're at with cooking. But maybe for you, you might want to prepare meals and drop them off to someone. Okay, perhaps you're not able to have people over. And as a little side tangent, again, we want to be aware of COVID restrictions and all of this, so please just hear me when I say that as well. But you might want to cook and gift people something. And so maybe as a household, you have a cooking day and you go and drop it off at people's homes. Maybe you can host a life group or a study group, a discussion group, a prayer group, some way of focusing people around God together in your home. Maybe you can open up spare rooms for people to live with, whether it's short-term or long-term. Maybe you've got rooms that aren't being used that might be able to host other people. Maybe together as a household, you might want to sponsor a child through World Vision or Compassion or other great organizations that are doing incredible work like that. Maybe for you, foster care or respite care or adoption, maybe these are conversations that you want to have in your household. Maybe it's about hosting social events and parties. And you go, what? But maybe it's about creating safe spaces so that young people don't have to find their entertainment out on the streets on a Friday night. Maybe it's about creating fun environments, safe environments for young people to feel at home and feel loved by somebody. Or maybe it's about getting together as a team and going to somebody else's house and blessing them. Maybe you get a bit of a working bee crew together in your home and you go and mow someone else's lawn or go and help them move homes or something like that. There are so many different ways that you can use what God has given you to do what he has called you to do. Your home, your household, the people in it are a resource. And God is calling us to steward those resources well so that other people would come to know him, so that we can love other people the way that God has first loved us. And so I want to cheer you on. I want to encourage you as missionaries and release you into this mission that God has got. I believe that he is going to do incredible things in your household. And as you steward this and invite God to lead you in this, I believe that your families, your streets, your neighborhoods, your communities are going to be blessed as a result.